Crop Growers offers all types of policies, including basic yield policies that provide coverage based on harvested yield per acre, and revenue policies with both upside and downside price protection. Cost depends on the crop, policy, and your location. That's why our crop insurance agents help you price out the best options and coverage level for your business. Crop Growers through Farm Credit is here to help you weather your financial ups and downs, no matter what crops up. Learn more at cropgrowers.com.
There. Thanks for joining us tonight, and I wanted to thank those sponsors for their donations to our program for our winter program season. Because of their donations, their sponsorships, we've been able to do this Fireside Chat series at no charge to participants, and we will also be doing Dairy Day at no charge to participants, thanks to them as well. So, thanks for joining us. Let me share my first screen here, my first slide. Can you all see that? I think you can. Everybody's muted. So we have just a few people on the line with us tonight. So I want to suggest that if you have any questions or comments at any point during this presentation, go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and speak up, and we'll address things as they come up, and then go from there. You won't be offending anybody if you do that. So we're going to talk about converting conventional corn planters for no-till planting. I only have a few slides, so there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion afterward. So that's the topic for tonight. I put a picture of a super old corn planter at the beginning here just to prompt me to say that almost any corn planter can be upgraded for no-till planting. Now, this one might be a limitation on that, but it's surprising how many of them you can make these upgrades to. So a little background, I thought first on no-till methods in the US. I just looked up today a report that's back in 2016. So 4 years ago. At that point, 70% of the soybeans and 60% of corn was planted in the US using some kind of conservation method, whether that's strip till or no-till or something in that order, reduced tillage anyway. Of those acres, only 27% of corn was actually no-tilled, zero tillage, and 56% of soybeans, which surprised me. I would have thought there would be more corn and maybe less soybeans. But so it's still, we got a ways to go. We have some improvements to make. Those no-till methods are most popular, most common across the upper Midwest and northern Great Plains. Part of that is because of the corn, soybean, wheat type of rotation. Sometimes it's just a corn, soybean rotation. Sometimes there's some wheat in there. Those rotations lend themselves well to no-till planting, and the soils lend themselves well to no-till planting. But we are further behind in the Northeast at adopting some of these strategies. because of our, I think, field size, our soil types, and the fact that we are very dairy dominated. That's not a feature of the Midwest. There's dairies out there, but they're not as dominated by dairy farming as we are here. Dairy farming has a few challenges. There's manure applications to factor in. We like to till those in because we know we can capture more nutrients that way. We have very heavy equipment on the fields, which results in compaction and ruts, and tillage helps us deal with compaction and ruts. We have perennial forage seedings to put in, and those tiny seeds are a little bit daunting to plant with no-till methods. But then we also, at the other end of that perennial forage phase of the rotation, we have a sod to deal with. And sometimes there's better results on some farms, or at least there's the understanding that there's better results with tilling those sods and breaking them up a little bit. Now, all of those limitations said, we still are making progress on those, and we're making progress on each of those, I guess, challenges, limitations, roadblocks to permit more no-till planting on dairy farms, on Northeast farms. But all that said, creativity and courage is definitely needed. This is not a straightforward leap, but that is those two features are common for our farmers too. They're not afraid of a challenge. So it is being adopted, but slowly. This conversation started amongst this group, really got a great start back in 2019 when we had that Soil Health for Dairy Farms field day over here in St. Lawrence County. We had a very good turnout of a bunch of farms and good discussion. Lots of energy came out of that meeting. The farmer to farmer discussion was excellent. So in order to keep that, to take advantage of that energy, to keep the topic going, here we are tonight talking about this because subsequent to that field day, I went around and did some interviews and discussions with some of those farms that had adopted no-till methods here in Northern New York. I did that, most of it this fall. Went around and talked to some farms that were committed to no-till. Some of them, the most important, the ones I learned the most from and that I've leaned on the hardest have not touched a tillage implement in 10 or 15 years. And then Pete Hagar in Clinton County at the Soil and Water Office, he's on the line here tonight to participate in this conversation. He got a grant to assist a few farms over in the Champlain Valley Basin to convert some conventional planters to no-till, to upgrade them to be to permit them to plant no-till, reduce tillage around the Champlain Basin. So that spurred some more conversations, and I'll turn it to you for a few minutes here, Pete.
Thanks, Kitty. Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you.
Okay, well, so, obviously soil and water districts have always had a big interest in reducing erosion and improving water quality by reducing tillage and implementing no-till and reduced tillage practices. So we were fortunate enough to get a grant from the Lake Champlain Basin program to offer funding to 7 farms to upgrade their planters to make them more no-till capable. We engaged, with Kitty to do some research and helping us decide what these farmers needed for their corn planters, and we're working on getting the components that they need to do so. So we're looking forward to next spring when we hopefully have a group of 7 farmers that are willing to give it a shot and see if we can, as an example to other farmers that maybe they can reduce tillage. I mean, I think one of the big, reasons that some of them are interested in doing it is to reduce fuel use, time, make it more efficient, do less tillage and pick less rocks. So that's kind of where we're at now.
All right. Yeah, thanks. So Pete, I'm grateful that you got the grant to do this, because that was another motivating factor to hurry up and write some of this stuff up and complete some of those farmer interviews and discussions. And What we learned from all that, I've written up in a kind of a too long article for a newsletter, but it's going to be in the January North Country Regional Ag Team Ag Advisor newsletter. And it's kind of summarized very briefly here in this presentation tonight. So, and all of it came out of, I feel like for me anyway, started last year with that field day in St. Lawrence County, which the St. Lawrence County Soil and Water Office was very instrumental in making that happen. We worked together with them to put that one together. So let's talk about converting corn planters. Oh. So general points to begin here, and then we'll go kind of front to back through the corn planter and talk about some other components. But generally, it turns out almost any planter can be upgraded. The newer ones are much easier to upgrade than the older ones. And sometimes the newer ones don't even need to be upgraded. That even if they aren't sold as a no-till planter, they often can be a no-till planter. But the older ones, there's a ton of John Deere, Kinsey, Case, and White planters out there. Those seem to be the most popular ones. A lot of them have the potential to be upgraded for no-till methods. That's the first point. The second point is there isn't one way to do this. There is not one set of doodads to put on a corn planter to make it work for you. It depends on what kind of crops you grow. It depends what your rotation is. It depends what kind of soil types you work with. Do you have stones? Do you have a lot of slope? Do you end up planting into wet soils a lot in the spring? Or don't you? Do you have a lot of sand? What kind of residues are you dealing with? Sometimes there's hardly any residues. One of the farms I interviewed for that contributed heavily to this set of information that we're talking about tonight is a dairy farm here in Northern New York. Another one that was really important is a cash crop farm. Completely different crop rotations, completely different set of residues and soil types. And yet they had some common ideas, which we'll mention as we go through this, about certain things that were important to them. How do you apply fertilizer? A lot of these planter upgrades are a little easier to accomplish if you use liquid. There's less choices about ways to upgrade if you need to apply dry granular fertilizer, although it's not impossible. And then how you manage weeds, because it really comes into play. It makes using no-till methods tends to make a farm more reliant on herbicides and getting the herbicide mixtures and timings right, because you do not have any tillage to help you reduce weed populations. That said, organic farms can make this work too. They need different strategies though, like planting into a rye cover crop that's rolled and crimped ahead of the plant or something like that. So not a one size fits all solution for any of this. Lots of trial and error is needed. Whoop. One of the most key points I learned from these conversations, I thought that no-till planters were basically just bigger, burlier, heavier versions of conventional corn planters. That is not at all the case. These are not weight, I guess is the way to say it. Weight of the corn planter is not important. Extra heavy weight is not essential at all. However, excuse me, down pressure on the row units is very important. That is essential. But that's not accomplished with weight. That is accomplished with hydraulic or spring down pressure systems. And so one of the things that often needs to be added to or upgraded on conventional corn planter are those springs or a hydraulic system to provide enough down pressure on the row units. The parts of a no-till corn planter, I want to say they're engineered to deliver one little step in the planting process a little bit more precisely. It turns out tillage is an advantage for planting a lot of crops because it allows you to get away with imperfect planter function. You don't get away with it in a no-till planter in the same way you might get away with it in conventional tillage type planting. there's a lot of things that loosened, fluffy soil lets you do that a firm, structured, untill soil will not let you do. So maybe I can refer back to that as we go through some of the planter parts. But I feel like the little gizmos and steps, the parts in the no-till planter, each have a very and a more specific role to carry out. So the basic principles of a conventional planter or a no-till planter are the same, however. There's got to be a furrow cut into the soil and through residues to open a small little furrow, which may be V-shaped or it may be squared off on the bottom. It needs to be a consistent depth, but that's the same for conventional or no-till. Then the seed has to be dropped into that furrow consistently at a metered rate, right to the bottom of that furrow. It can't get hung up on the sides. And there needs to be very firm seed to soil contact, which is why it needs to be at the bottom of that furrow. It can't be up in the looser, fluffier stuff, even in a conventional planter. And then the last step is the furrow needs to be closed. The soil needs to be closed over the seed, but without causing compaction. In a loose tilled fluffy soil, that's pretty straightforward and maybe easy to accomplish. There's a little bit of a different strategy in a no-till planter, but the basic principles are the same. Cut a furrow, drop in the seed, close the furrow. And here's a picture of a conventional planter. So the very first thing to touch the soil here is this. Oh, I didn't really. Okay, so behind this yellow wheel that's at the bottom underneath the seed box, behind that's a gauge wheel. Behind that yellow wheel is a disc opener, a circular two discs, a set of two discs, sharp, rolling, slicing a furrow into the soil and opening a small furrow. There's a seed tube that directs seed from the seed box up on top down behind those two little disc openers to drop the seed into the furrow. And then there are closing wheels on the back. These two angled closing wheels on the back basically just sort of firm some of that fluffy soil, compress that furrow, soil over the furrow, and you hopefully end up with consistently seeds at a consistent depth with soil firmed over the top of them adequately, but not with any compaction. So that's how a conventional corn planter works. A no-till corn planter has similar features, but they're a little bit different. The very first thing on this planter that's out front there, the front is toward the right again. This particular planter is traveling from left to right. So the front is at the right. The very first part out there, that spiky wheel thing, is a row cleaner kind of a wheel. It is tuned to run just above the soil. It doesn't want to touch the soil, but it wants to sweep crop residues away from the row just slightly. And then inside that toothy row cleaner wheel, there's a fluted coulter. The job that coulter is doing is just loosening soil a little bit right in the row. It's kind of like maybe a 2-inch wide tillage pass right there in front of the row. And then we run into the same kind of parts as the conventional planter. I wanted to mention the row cleaner and the fluted coulter are not present on all no-till planters. In many cases, farmers say they're not needed. In fact, the farmers I spoke with the most here in Northern New York say they don't need them, that they have taken them off. They don't care to use them in any circumstance. However, I suspect there's some cases where they might be needed, but they're not always needed. So you won't always see those on a no-till planter. Okay, so behind that row cleaner and fluted coulter, there is a double disc opener. Again, behind that, the gauge wheel on this planter is black, but in behind that, there's two gauge wheels, one on each side, and sandwiched in between is a double disc opener, two discs opening that V or flat bottomed skinny little furrow. And inside between those discs is a seed tube that drops seed from the seed unit up above down into the row. One thing that's often present on a no-till planter that you would not find on a conventional planter is a little guard in front of the end of the seed tube, because it turns out in these untilled soils, the seed tube will wear out really a lot faster. So you can either change the seed tubes more frequently, or you can stick this little guard in there. I should also point out the double disc opener there that opens the furrow, those also wear out a lot faster, cutting into firm untilled soils. And they kind of must be heavy duty for that purpose. Extra heavy, extra thick, and changed on a schedule that the manufacturer recommends. You can't get away with dull, worn ones at all. You could maybe in a conventional planter, but not in a no-till planter. So those are a little different from a conventional planter. The seed tube guard is a little different. You don't run into those on a conventional planter. And then here's another tweak that's often present on these no-tills. There's this little finger that runs down the furrow just behind the seed tube that firms the seed into the bottom of the furrow. The goal is to push that seed right firmly into the bottom untilled edge of that furrow. So that's where most of the seed to soil contact comes from, is down there at the bottom of the furrow where the soil has not been touched. So that's called a seed firmer. And then the closing wheel on the back. You see this last thing over at the left, this kind of spiral toothy, kind of outer space looking closing wheel on the back. On a conventional planter, let me back up. On a conventional planter here, I forgot to mention those closing wheels are, I don't know, they're almost kind of a silly seeming flimsiest part of the planter. They're just kind of plastic, smooth edged closing wheels. They don't have a lot of pressure on them. And they just sort of roll along and firm the furrow over the seed. Here on a no-till planter, the closing wheels I think they're one of the most important upgrades to make. They tend to be spiky, toothy kinds of closing wheels. They're often at a more aggressive angle. And the goal of those closing wheels is to kind of shatter the sides of the furrow and loosely close the furrow without causing any compaction. The goal is for the seed to soil contact to be provided down at the bottom of the furrow by untilled soil or undisturbed soil mostly, so that the soil above the seed can be left sort of loose and easy for the seedling to explore and push through. That's the goal. So those parts are a little bit different. Here's the back end of a planter that's been converted for no-till. There's a couple things going on here. You can notice that they have two different kinds of closing wheels. One normal that you would find on a conventional planter, and one spiky toothy kind to sort of shatter just one side of the furrow. And that is one thing that came out of conversations at our soil health field day last year. Is there's one farm that likes to do it that way, just one toothy wheel and one smooth regular wheel. The other thing I will point out is these gauge wheels, the big wide rubber wheels that are up in front of the closing wheels. This planter has these new gauge wheels that have a little concave section right on the inside so that there is no compaction onto the furrow edge by those gauge wheels. So they aren't perfectly flat. They have that little concave cutout right against the middle, the center. This is actually a no-till drill, but it has some of the same closing wheels as a corn planter might have. So I wanted to include this picture. This farm decided to try several different kinds of closing wheels and do his own experiment. So over here on the right end, he's got two what are called Thompson closing wheels, these toothy, rigid metal wheels. He's got one sort of conventional normal looking one, and then he's got another set of kind of spiky toothy closing wheels there that are not Thompson, and I'm not sure what the brand is, but similar design. And this farm purposefully did this to make a direct comparison, to look at populations and he can go across the field and he knows which 4 rows were planted with different closing wheels, and he can count populations and make direct comparisons. So to summarize, there is not one solution for everybody that works in all situations. A farm is going to have some creativity and courage and do some trial and error and figure out what works. Maybe take the approach like that last slide and try a couple rows of one thing and a couple other rows of something else. Down pressure is very critical on the seed units. Overall weight of the planter is not at all important. In fact, one of the farms that contributed a lot to my knowledge has removed everything off the planter that he possibly can to make it as light as possible for reduction of overall compaction by all of his farm equipment. He doesn't want his planter to be heavy, but he does have heavy duty springs to push the row units down. So down pressure on the row units is critical. Overall planter weight is definitely not. Those row cleaners or residue sweepers in the front coulter out in front of the plant, in front of the double disc opener, usually not necessary according to these farms. However, I'm sure there's some situations where it would be helpful. Maybe planting into big, tall cover crop residue, perhaps, although these guys do that too and don't run into trouble where it's needed. Those double disc row openers, they are the equipment responsible for cutting a furrow. They have to be heavy duty and they have to be replaced on a schedule, and you can't cut corners on that, it sounds like. Behind those double disc row openers are the seed tubes. They will wear faster, either have to replace them more often or maybe use a seed guard or a seed tube guard. And there's one of those seed tube guards that permits liquid fertilizer application in furrow as well. So those seed tube guards can do 2 jobs at once. Seed firmers like the Keaton, Pete, what are they called? Keaton seed. They have
it's a Keaton seed firmer.
Oh, okay.
But they also add an additional spring, sometimes called a mojo wire.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the Keaton brand of those seed firmers was specifically mentioned by the 2 really experienced farmers that were part of my interview group. They both use those across different cropping types and soil types and cropping rotations. They both liked those. Yeah, and the extra mojo wire spring gives it a little more tension to really push those seeds down hard. They didn't mention those mojo wires, but I know some farms like those too. So the double disc row openers are really important. The seed firmers were mentioned as really important. The closing wheels are the other top most important part, I would say. And there are just literally dozens of options for closing wheels. The 2 most experienced farmers that I talked to here in Northern New York both like the Thompson closing wheel, but I guess the bottom line is the toothy spiky ones work the best. And better than the smooth round ones, the smooth plastic type that come on conventional planters generally. So the double disc row openers and the closing wheels maybe are the most important places to focus your decision making, I guess, to make these upgrades. So there's a lot of different manufacturers of these parts. There's a lot of places to look and to shop. I listed all these suppliers. These are manufacturers and or dealers, and I don't know necessarily which ones are which. But I listed them all at the end of the article that's going to be in the January newsletter, plus some of our local dealerships that that deal in these brands, and some of the manufacturers that actually make the planters, Kinsey and John Deere and Case and White. Some of those companies have no-till parts too, but a lot of times they're using stuff from these guys as well. So I listed those in the article that's going to come out. Now there's a couple last things that were not mentioned here tonight. Fertilizer application. A lot of times this is accomplished on a conventional planter with a little disc opener way out in front of the planter. That dribbles fertilizer either into the furrow or typically off to the side a couple of inches. I didn't talk about that because that's one of the parts that I think takes more trial and error and maybe subject to farmer preference more. Some of the manufacturers don't like putting a fertilizer disc opener off to the side by a couple of inches because they say it kind of interferes with the way you want the furrow to function, and it tends to cause a little bit of compaction. They don't like it, but it can be done. And I think I have a couple pictures coming up maybe of some options for placing fertilizer in the furrow way at the back of the planter. I didn't talk about row markers, those arms that kick off to the side and mark where you should aim the next pass. They don't work very well if the soil isn't tilled. It's hard to see anything. So they make some special row markers with hydraulic down pressure and big aggressive coulters on the end, or you can use a foam row marker, or you can use a GPS system and eliminate the need for a row marker altogether. And then for some organic farms, many of them like to use a roller crimper out in front of the planter, either mounted on the planter or probably better yet, mounted on the front of the tractor to roll down a rye cover crop like in this picture in front of the planter. This planter has roller crimper units mounted right onto the front of each row unit to knock that rye down, flatten it for the planter unit behind. So some more things to consider if those are important to a farm that I didn't really talk about here. That's all I got. Anybody got questions, comments? This has been a really cool topic to talk to farms about, and there's more work to do. We don't have that many farmers who have adopted these strategies up here in Northern New York. There's just a handful. So Pete, I'm really happy you got that grant to spur that kind of change on another handful of farms, and we'll, follow that up and try to keep track of how that goes for those farms.
So I had a couple of comments of things that I've learned in my, of course, like you, I've been doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of farms and reading a lot of sales pitches of all these companies. And a couple of things that I would comment on is that the seed tube guard that they add into this is like a chrome plated seed tube guard that actually controls the width of the trench by making sure that the angle of the discs is precise. So on the heavier discs, you need to have the seed tube guard in there, making sure they are set at the precise angle. So the seed tube guard is like a little wedge that the discs ride against. And that keeps the bottom of the trench to be like a little, like a flat bottom trench as opposed to a V. Because in order for the seed tube or the seed firmers to work properly, you've got to get that seed pushed right to the bottom of the trench.
You don't want to get hung up in the skinny part of the V without going all the way down to the bottom, right?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Another point that another one of these manufacturers made is about the reduced diameter gauge wheels. And actually they were arguing against that because if you had clay soils, it's a little bit wet, the disc could actually pull soil up away from your seed, and it might not have a good seed, soil contact in the bottom of the furrow.
So you're talking about the gauge wheels like this picture, right?
Right. So if there's a way for soil to, if the disc is going through clay and it's rotating and it's pulling the clay up again, it may actually reduce your seed contact with the soil at the bottom of the trench. That was one argument anyway. But like you say, there's so many brands of different closing wheels. It's a challenge.
One thing I also heard a lot of, Pete, is these farmers referred a lot to mud accumulation on various different parts of the planter. Mm-hmm. And the need to take steps to prevent that from happening or to somehow address it, because mud accumulation on some of these parts sort of prevents them from functioning exactly right. And so that's something to consider, that if you end up planting into wet conditions, A, you want to pick parts that work well in wet conditions, but B, think about where mud is going to accumulate and how you're going to deal with that. They make gauge wheels that one farm finally changed to, and he said they made a huge difference. They weren't important to him in his initial conversion of the planter. He only came to this, 10 years into it. He put those, what are they called? Mudsmith gauge wheels on. They have spokes.
Right.
The centers are open and they have spokes. I don't understand how that prevents mud accumulation, but they do apparently. He said they made a huge difference. He just doesn't have mud accumulating on the gauge wheels anymore. So his depth is more consistent.
Of course, they could probably just not plant when it's muddy.
Well, there's that too, right?
Because you're going to have more compaction. If it's wet and muddy, it's not going to be, it's good.
Anybody else got anything? Myra, I think this was, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was your organization that provided the grant.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
It's really exciting, and I've learned a lot tonight. So thanks for digging into this, Kitty.
Oh man, well, I'm sorry to say, Myra, this is the tip of the iceberg.
I hear you. Couple of things that I also did a little bit of homework on these when this grant was being formed, and a couple of things that people keep talking about a lot is the depth of the seed and how important it is to find the moisture line in your soil and not go much below that, but to hit that line. Is that something that can't, with those pressure wheels and with the gauge wheels selection, I guess I don't quite understand how it all fits together, but they were talking about there are different gauge wheels, whether they're narrow or they're wide, and how that makes a difference.
Yeah, the farms that I talked to really didn't say too much about the gauge wheels. Like that didn't rise to the top as something that was one of the first things to upgrade. You got to upgrade the double disc openers. You got to upgrade the closing wheels. And you would have to deal with fertilizer application somehow. But there's a lot of options for that.
So
but the gauge wheels
sound important, right?
Say that again.
The openers, are they important? Is that what I heard?
Yes, they have to be. They're still very similar to conventional, like design wise, they're not terribly different, but they're much heavier, so that they remain sharp and wear better. Because that is one thing that came out of this, is that the wear parts wear really a lot faster on a no-till planter compared with.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
That reminds me, like, what happens if there's a lot of down pressure on that row thing? Is there any way to bring it up in situations where, it might not need to be that heavy? Does something bring it up? How does it know, or is it always one weight?
So maybe Mike Hunter and Pete want to comment on this too. Those gauge wheels are responsible for controlling the depth. So like the relative difference between the gauge wheels and the depth of the double disc openers. If you want the double disc opener, or if you want the seed shallower, then you pull them together. If you want it deeper, then you force the double disc opener further down past the gauge wheels, right? So the gauge wheels ride on the surface, and the down pressure isn't what determines the depth of the seed as much as the gauge wheel and double disc opener relationship, right? The pressure is just there to make sure the double disc opener goes to its limit. Does that make sense?
A lot of those springs are adjustable as well.
Yeah.
So if you've got, if it's softer soil, you could set those springs for less pressure.
But it wouldn't necessarily change the depth of the seed.
Correct.
Right. Does that make sense, Myra?
Yeah, thanks. That does.
Yeah, those gauge wheels and the double disc opener, that relationship between those two determines the seed depth. The other thing that I learned is that if there's a fluted coulter or some kind of coulter out in front, that needs to be set a lot less deep than the double disc opener. You do not want it to go very deep. And I think that's because if you set it deeply, it takes some of the down pressure off the double disc opener and the gauge wheels. So you end up with inconsistently placed seed.
It's also,
So it needs, yep.
sorry, possible for if you have it set too deep, then you'll have a false bottom. You'll actually have a deeper bottom than what you want your seed to go in. I know on our no-till drill that happens sometimes where people really want the coulter in the ground and their seed drops in 3 inches and the seed opener is trying to put it at a 1 inch and you've got this slot that the seed falls in and you never see it again.
I did find it really interesting that the seed to soil contact is accomplished kind of differently with these no-till planters. It's mostly accomplished by that the shape of the furrow and the seed firmer little finger, the Keaton seed firmers or whatever similar. Have you come across any planters that don't have seed firmers? Pete, is that even like, it seems like that wouldn't be a good idea.
Well, most of the ones that we're looking at right now don't have seed firmers, and yet a lot of conventional ones do. I mean, you look at most of the newer, bigger planters, and they almost all have seed firmers. But
that answers my question.
They are retrofitting older 4 and 6 row planters, and there's only one of them that has seed firmers on.
Yep. Okay, so newer planters, whether they're conventional or no-till, would have seed firmers.
I would gather.
Got it. So the seed to soil contact in these no-till planters appears to be accomplished by the furrow shape and the seed firmer, not by the closing wheels. The closing wheels just sort of lightly collapse the furrow over the seed. On a conventional planter, I think those closing wheels kind of push the soil down a little bit to get good seed to soil contact, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, and so I know at least on the Thompson wheels, they actually provide a lighter duty spring for the down pressure on your
right on the end,
because you don't need as much down pressure on a spiked wheel as you do on the solid wheel.
Yep. So that's what I mean. These things are not just a heavier version of the same kind of planter, but the parts are doing something a little bit differently as well. Anybody got anything else?
So one of the questions that maybe you can answer, you and Mike might be more of on the agronomic side, is that are they going to lose yield? I mean, I think a lot of farmers are worried about no-till and yield loss.
Yeah. So what I've been reading is that you shouldn't. However, there is going to be a learning curve, right? You're going to have to figure out how to adapt all the other parts of your whole system to sort of optimize yield. For example, if residues from the previous year are somehow left in a problematic form, well, that might, cause some problems and you might reduce yield. It might be that you have to sort of learn what kind of soil moisture is workable or not. Again, that might be a little bit different. The herbicide program, and maybe, I don't know, Mike, if you have anything to say about that, but the herbicide program's really got to be good because you don't have anything else to help you. And so just the learning curve on all these different parts of the system to me mean that there's potential for a little bit of yield hit while you're sorting through that. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I think the big one on the herbicide side of it though, Kitty, as you mentioned, the no-till is different because with conventional planting, tillage is our first herbicide pass or our burn down basically. And so with no-till planting, we need to, in a conventional system, we're a conventional no-till system, we're going to be looking at a burn down herbicide program to start clean. That's really the big thing is start clean. So that's going to be a component of it. And we don't have the luxury of doing tillage. And then, yeah, so that's important. And it's different. I mean, that's a learning curve for everybody that
Yeah.
enters that, because you're going to also see a transition in some of the weed species that you're used to seeing.
Yeah, there's some new weeds that are possible in a no-till system, and pests too, that you wouldn't normally see
Right.
in a conventional.
Insect pests are big. Insects and slugs are two things, that we have to watch as well. So there's some different nuances with it when you switch over from, as you said before, tillage, hides some of the planting mistakes. Tillage also does some stuff for pest control, that we don't typically think of.
Yeah, I do. So I think as you're sort of working through that, there is potential for some yield hits, for some loss. But I don't think there's a direct cause of a loss because of the no-till planting necessarily.
I think, and the one farmer that I discussed this with, he was aware of the potential and also accepting of that, because he knew he was going to reduce his tillage, which would save him time and fuel and wear and tear and that type of thing. I think, the benefit of the grant is that, like you said, a lot of these need trial and error, and this is part of it.
Right.
We can help these farmers, try some different things, and we cross our fingers and hope they all work perfectly, but they may not.
No, you've definitely lowered the barrier, one of the barriers to the decision to go ahead and try this, right? And yeah, so I don't know. Trial and error is unfortunately always going to be necessary, but at the same time, farmers are really good at that.
Well, they also got to realize that just because they bolt all this stuff on doesn't mean they can't unbolt it and
Right.
Try something different, like
Yep.
try one spike wheel and one solid wheel. They're not going to throw them away.
Nope.
A little trial and error, or even like that one guy did, put a few different closing wheel
Yep.
combinations on.
And then I think it takes some experience. Like, how do you know if your seed tubes are worn down and your double disc openers are too worn, and it's time to change the seed firmers? Like, it takes a few years to like even notice what to notice.
Right.
And
well, the one farm that had seed firmers on, they were on there, but they were about 5 years old and they were about as floppy as a wet noodle. So they weren't really doing what they were intended to do.
Yep. No, I think this is I'm really happy to be having this conversation tonight, and to have had the reason to write about it and do some of these interviews, because I do feel like we're a little behind on these adaptations up here in Northern New York, for good reasons. I mean, there are really good reasons why we haven't made more progress on it. And there's only just a few farmers who have, gone in whole hog and are fully committed to it. And this, I think, talking about it tonight, writing up the summary, we'll talk about it some more. We'll find other places to share that information. It's a way to take just a little bit of experience and sort of spread it around and help some other ones to get to the same point. There's definitely energy out there, interest in making some of these changes, but it's daunting. And talking to another farmer who's done it successfully is the best way, I think, to help that along. So let's keep talking about it. Anybody got anything else?
Hey, Kitty, it's Alice. I just want to say thanks. This has been definitely helpful for us. Because we have that one farm that you came to, and
Yeah. Yep.
We don't know a lot about this, so it's really useful for us. Thanks.
Well, and he's an interesting one too, because he doesn't fit into the same mold as any of the rest of them. So it's even less of a cookie cutter solution, which isn't really possible anyway, right? So, but they're a good farm to work with. They're very open-minded and progressive and willing to try stuff. And so my goal is to just stay in touch with some of these guys and see how it's going, help them with whatever next step they need, information or research. Heck, I mean, you know, they just need to say what they need. And I know everybody on the call is going to try to help them find that.
Right. So that farmer that Alice is talking about, I also talked to him, and he's one that's going to want to use liquid fertilizer and apply it through the Keaton seed firmers.
So liquid fertilizer application, that seems to be easier to accomplish with no-till than dry granular fertilizer. One of the farmers, the really experienced farmers that I've talked to a lot lately, sort of built his own system and has 2 little tubes that sort of dribble it on at the back, but for the closing wheel after the seed is dropped, dribbles it on just with 2 little tubes. He made it all himself. If you're going to put it in the furrow like that, that reduces how much fertilizer you can put on at planting compared with if it's off a couple inches, right? Because you don't want to burn that little seedling as it's trying to grow. What was my other point? Anyway, there are solutions out there, either out of the seed planter parts catalog or like this guy building your own. It can be done, but it's just, you know, the liquid versus dry is important. Whether it's in the furrow or off to the side is important, and how that fits in with the rest of your planting system, right? If you're used to side dressing, then it's not that big a deal to reduce fertilizer with the planter. Hopefully that's not a new thing to any of these guys, but it does mean you're going to have to side dress if you're going to put fertilizer in the furrow. One of the manufacturers didn't like the whole off to the side fertilizer thing, and his rationale made sense. He was one of the manufacturer guys, not the farmer. They both used liquid in the furrow. Anyway, more to learn there. Any other comments? Well, I don't have anything else, but I would just like to again thank Pete for the reason to talk about this with your grant and talk with those farmers, and Myra for having the grant to begin with, and Alice, you've been involved in that too. I've chit-chatted with Aaron Gabriel down in, what is that, Washington County, because he's got a farm that's involved in that grant too, and so we've all been trying to be as smart as possible and share all this information.
Well, we appreciate your involvement, Kitty, and
It's
been a
I love it.
yeah. I know. I spent way too much time looking at parts.
Well, yep. It's kind of just a different kind of Christmas shopping, right?
Exactly.
Some people, that's right.
So I got, this grant to blame for my wife not getting anything.
Yeah, well, that's all I have. If there's no other comments or anything, I will wish you all a great evening and a good Christmas, and please stay well. And thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah.
Take care.
Yeah. Good night, everybody.